Hey, historians, welcome to another review session. This time we're going to be tackling period three, parts two and three. If you recall, in period three, part one, we only went from the French and Indian War to right at the end of the American Revolution. And I made the argument that the American Revolution wasn't a single war, but rather a collection of events that really revolutionized American society, to include the Constitutional Convention and, of course, some of the growing pains of a new nation. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it, showcasing for us the importance of this time period in American history, which we found ourselves asking the fundamental question after the Revolutionary War: now what? Right? What do we do with our new found nation? How do we form our newfound nation? And so we're going to take a look at, and I was thinking earlier, now with this new modified DBQ, what are some potential topics that could be addressed in period three? What could the College Board hit us with? And I thought, well, it could really be covered under four huge umbrellas. The first being, of course, the French and Indian War. Right, analyzing the extent to which the French and Indian War altered the relationship between Britain and its North American colonies. Now, again, and I just want to be crystal clear about this, we don't know what's going to be on the national exam, but we could certainly, based on just the overarching themes of period three, deduce that one of the topics could be the French and Indian War, with a myriad of topics helping to support your writing. We could also look at the extent to which the American Revolution helped to shape the social, economic, and political structures of the United States. We could, after the American Revolution, perhaps look at the successful developments of a new national government. We could really provide a great argument for our thesis by saying, while the Articles of Confederation were successful in some aspects, it proved to be a failure in others. And while the Constitution proved to be a success in many areas, there were still many challenges to the U.S. Constitution, one of them being, for instance, the regrettable Three-Fifths Compromise. And the last part of this equation might be analyzing the extent to which the United States experienced domestic and international challenges, whether it be the XYZ affair, the Guinea affair, Jay's Treaty, and Pinckney Treaty. Perhaps there were some early domestic uprisings like the Newburgh Conspiracy, Shays, or Whiskey Rebellion. And so we're going to see that in the growing pains of this new nation from about 83 to 94, there were times when the United States was really holding on by a very thin string. So out of these, the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, a new national government structure, or domestic and international challenges, what we're going to call the growing pains of a new nation, these could be good areas to really focus our understanding of period three in moving towards a modified DBQ. Let's review our brief picture for period seven. In our last session, we talked about how the British attempted to reassert control of the colonies based on a time of salutary neglect and recouping some of the lost revenue or the debt from the French and Indian War. Well, the colonial reaction was strong. It started off with a little bit of boycotting, became stronger protests and formation of the Stamp Act Congress and the Albany Plan of Union, joining or dying, all the way to snowballs being thrown and gunshots firing in Boston in 1770 of the Boston Massacre, and of course the first shots being fired heard round the world in Lexington and Concord. And so now that these struggles are behind us, from at least a wartime footing, the United States is going to find itself in a precarious position to develop documents that are going to help shape what it is to be an American politically. And that's going to be done through two very experimentative documents that we're going to say are going to be the Articles of Confederation and the United States Constitution. Each have their merits, but each also have their challenges. And we're going to unpack that here for you right now. The Articles of Confederation, in essence, understanding why we needed a national document. Again, we're on the tail end of the American Revolution, and we did need something to unify the nation, because right after the war was over with and the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown freed the United States up, and of course the Treaty of Paris signed in 83, the U.S. needed something to identify it nationally. Right? It was up until this point a loose confederation of states. It almost looked more like the European Union does today, with, of course, the opportunity to Brexit, where states could kind of come in or out or challenge federal authority. And so the first step of doing this was the Articles of Confederation, and it proved to be a weakness, not establishing enough authority over the states. But one of the overarching, somewhat successes to the Articles of Confederation was helping to control, through this controlled failure, at least the rapid expansion of the United States West. You know, after the proclamation line of 1763 was removed, I like to picture Western expansion looking like Best Buy at Thanksgiving, the day after Thanksgiving, in which the doors open and the crowds rush into Best Buy. So much like that, the country was rapidly expanding westward at a very, very quick rate. And so the United States needed a way to do two things: generate revenue for the national government and to control expansion so it didn't get too fast or too complicated, creating more conflicts, not just amongst Americans, but amongst the Native Americans that are living out there, the British that are still out there in their forts, as well as the French trading partners that have been there for the better part of a century. And we find that there's too much variation between the state governments and legislatures. By this point, what really constitutes a law politically in one state might not transfer into a law into another. For instance, a punishment for an infraction like murder or treason might be punished differently than in other states. And so this national document wanted to, in essence, unify the nation through a judicial process that mirrored other states. And of course, states aren't going to jump on board with this. They'd like to say that stealing a crop in Virginia is going to be more punished than stealing a crop in Massachusetts. So there's too much variation between the states. So we need a national document to help kind of provide some of that codified law, that egalitarianist law, if you will. Difficulties over international trade, right? Certain states were setting up trade laws and restrictions and even tariffs with foreign nations, whether it be in the Caribbean, Latin America, or Europe. So there was difficulties over international trade. And so this new national document was to help unify the nation under international trade, preventing an imbalance against finances of states. Certain states did have a larger aggregate output of growth. They did have a stronger manufacturing sector, or they were more populated and offered more jobs. Therefore, they were more successful than other states, particularly in the South. So this imbalance of finances between the states really caused the country to need a unifying national document, also to control interstate commerce between two states. New Jersey and New York, for instance, could trade with each other and have a very specific trade policy, but that policy might be challenged between New York and Connecticut. So what the Articles of Confederation is going to do is to try to bring about again, and it sounds very similar to the other bullet points, an equal footing of interstate commerce between all of the states now that are a part of the Union. And it's going to attempt to unify foreign policy. You know, one of the most important foreign policy tools is the ability to declare war. And so it's going to be the important role of the United States really to sign treaties, to unify with other nations through alliances, or in a regrettable sense, to declare war. We can't have individual states declaring war against other parts of the world. And so the Articles of Confederation is going to attempt to provide some guidance in that realm. And lastly, the internal unrest and rebellions that are taking place. I'm looking at the Newburgh Conspiracy, Shays Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, all of these domestic insurrections and uprising, largely in Appalachia, in the Piedmont region and the mountains out west. Not the Rockies, the Appalachians. That unrest is going to be problematic as people actually take up arms against the federal government. And so it's going to require Washington and troops to go in and quell some of that violence that's taking place by saying, yes, you're going to pay this whiskey tax. The federal law reigns supreme. Some of the underlying questions that are going to come out of the convention that's going to generate these Articles of Confederation is, what type of legislature should we have? They're going to say a unicameral, one house legislature. Are we going to have a president or a governor or a king? Are we going to have a national capital? And how are we going to balance the state and federal government? So while the national document was needed and the Articles of Confederation were generated, in the end, it actually produced more questions than it did solutions. And that's going to require those that are in power to come together clandestinely to form a new Articles of Confederation 2.0, which we'll call the U.S. Constitution. There's those early national rebellions. You know, the Newburgh Conspiracy was an uprising within the military ranks. This is on the heels of the end of the Revolutionary War, in which officers weren't getting paid. And if you're not going to pay officers, well, they're going to walk. And George Washington, even in those old words, tired, takes his glasses off and says, my poor sight is failing me, and I'm just an old war general, and appeals to the pathos of these soldiers who finally say, you know, he's right. We've got to do this for the better cause of the American patriot cause. And so they're going to stay on board. But it could have spelled disaster for the nation had we have lost these officers. And it all came down to paying them. How can we pay officers if we don't have a national treasury or a way to get states to pay in? They're not going to, you know, have a GoFundMe or donate money to the federal government. So we need a central treasury, a central source of pooling money to keep a standing army well equipped and well paid. From a taxation standpoint and foreclosures of farm, Daniel Shea is going to have a rebellion out in the Western mountains to push back against the merchants of the East Coast that are looking to collect on debt. You know, times are tough. The economy is hard. They're not getting the kind of pay or return on their products. And so they're going to seek to have some kind of compensation, or at the very least, not repossessing their farms. But that doesn't stop the lenders of the East Coast, the bankers, the financiers, to proceed with repossessions. And so they're going to push back rather violently, saying that this is not right. And couple that with taxation from the states is going to require Daniel Shea and his cohorts to enact violence in this time period. Couple that with the Whiskey Rebellion, which Alexander Hamilton calls on George Washington to send thousands of troops out there to quell this. Whiskey was not only being taxed from an excise standpoint of a sales tax of finished product, but also the materials used to make that whiskey was being taxed. And as you saw just a few decades earlier, well, taxing paper goods and sugar and tea didn't bode well for the British Empire. Well, you're not going to tax whiskey to those living in the Western frontier. That's going to pose problems. And so, in essence, it's going to ask, how does the Newburgh and Shays and Whiskey Rebellion lead to the writing of this new Constitution? And then how does the Whiskey Uprising test the new Constitution? Of course, Whiskey Rebellion coming in after the Constitution. So Shays and Newburgh's prompts the writing of a new Constitution. It's one of the many causes for writing a new Constitution. And then when the Constitution is finally put into place, the Whiskey Rebellion occurs, and it is quickly quelled by Washington and his troops, showing that the new solidified national document proved to be rather successful. If we look at some of the successes of the Articles of Confederation, we can point to two specific areas. Number one, the Land Ordinance of 1785, which looks for two things: ways that the United States can control Western migration through, as you could see here on the map, providing specific sections of land, some reserved for schools, other reserved for townships like City Hall, and others reserved for religious institutions. And others could purchase these for a nominal fee, and that would generate some revenue for the federal government. Again, remember, the federal government can't raise taxes, so these land ordinances that are sold are going to provide some structure and revenue for westward expansion. And if you fly over the country at 35,000 feet, particularly in the grasslands of Iowa or Nebraska or Kansas, you can still see, if you look out your window, those squares that are in place as the land ordinance continued to guide the country moving westward. Coupled with the land ordinance of 1785, we have the Northwest Territory of 1787. And while the land ordinance was a way for you individually to purchase land in a controlled method while generating revenue for the government, the Northwest Ordinance is going to see that after you get past 60,000 residents, they can apply for statehood. But there is going to be a very controversial component to this, and that is the banning of slavery. Now, I'm not going to say that the Northwest Territory is a direct cause of the Civil War pitting North against South. There are going to be many other territorial disputes that are going to do that. But if you're writing a formal right based on analyzing the extent to which the slavery issue evolved from colonial America and revolutionary America to the Civil War, I would certainly include the Northwest Territory in there as the first line that has been drawn in the sand of not allowing slavery to expand into this area, particularly north of the Ohio River Valley and in and around the Great Lakes. So there it is in a nutshell. The Articles of Confederation are going to see significant weaknesses like Congress's inability to levy taxes. There is no executive or judicial branch, so there's no check or balance on this unicameral legislature. Congress is unable to settle disputes between states. They're very much weakened and have the inability to put their foot down in disputes, whether it be interstate commerce or trade. And states could declare war against each other or even countries without congressional consent. And that's just simply not going to work. We have to have a unified foreign policy, a singular nation that can focus on treaties as well as declaring war. Out of this controlled failure, we did see some successes like that Land Ordinance of 85, the Northwest Ordinance of 87 as the only way for the country to raise that revenue. So in comes the new United States Constitution. Now, 5 states did meet quietly in Annapolis in 1786 to discuss, and interestingly enough, if you see there on the slide, the commercial problems facing the United States under the Articles of Confederation. Notice there's none of that kind of feel-good liberty and justice and all of those buzzwords for what the American spirit entails, but it's going to be much more to protect the merchant class interests, specifically with trade policies and tariffs and interstate commerce, to find out what they're going to do. So they get together, try to amend and rewrite and reword the Articles of Confederation, and they're finding that this process is too challenging and too difficult. And so they're going to agree that a few months later, they're going to meet for 4 months in Philadelphia to hammer out, with more states involved, a new constitution. It's going to have intense negotiation, lots of collaboration, lots of compromise in Philadelphia over a number of issues. Now, how was this process politically handled with the American people? Well, they asked George Washington to preside over the proceedings, to add his authority to the undertaking. Washington, even in his own memoirs, will say that he didn't really provide much to the discussion or the debate. He would weigh in when he was asked, but he would quietly kind of sit there like a stoic war general in uniform, of course, kind of overseeing the process. And in turn, if the American people knew that Washington sat in on this, this would be a valid process and they could get behind that. So there were some political reasons behind Washington's attendance to this. But the issues at the convention are going to be numerous, but they're really going to focus on specifically representation in this unicameral or bicameral legislature. They haven't decided yet on slave states in Congress. How are slaves going to be counted? Regrettably, they come up with the 3/5 compromise. So popular representation, proportional representation based on population, will still include the slave, but will do so at 3/5 of a human being. One of the regrettable issues at the Constitutional Convention that was ratifying. It's also going to look at the role of the federal government in the regulating of the slave trade, particularly prohibiting that slave trade after 1808. The founders thought if they stop slavery at the border and prevent more slaves from coming in from Africa, that they could, in essence, let that peculiar institution slowly die out. And as we know from following U.S. history, that the natural reproduction of the slaves, as well as being in perpetual bondage to their masters, is not going to allow for reduction in this peculiar institution, but sadly a dramatic increase in that institution once cotton moves onto the scene in antebellum America. So that road to ratification is going to be painted with 2 specific paradigms: the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. They're going to call for a strong central government, look for checks and balances on power. Remember, for you and I to say limited power, well, that seems to roll off our tongue very easily. But in this time period, what did limited power look like? So they're going to say that you need to separate power, put it into smaller buckets, and then each of those buckets, while sharing an equal balance of that power, are going to be able to check each other for very specific reasons. And again, a casual Google search, I'm not going to spend time today talking about those checks and balances, but you could find those on your own and see how the executive branch can check the legislative branch and how the judicial branch can check the executive. etc. And they're going to be a largely merchant class group of individuals, very educated. They're going to be your John Adamses of the Northeast, the merchant classes in New York, particularly in the North and the Mid-Atlantic. They're going to articulate their case in a number of articles that are going to be released systematically over the course of the ratification debates of the Constitution, really persuading the American people that what they're doing is right. You have to, again, go back to the context of these people. They threw off the shackles of a tyrannical king, tyrannical in their eyes, a tyrannical king, and they're now having to sell a replacement of power with new power, right? So that's going to be seen in a myriad of those papers called the Federalist Papers. And the chief negotiating tool out of this that's really going to get the anti-federalists on board is an inclusion of a Bill of Rights. I've said in class numerous times that the Constitution is a contract between the states and the federal government. It has really nothing to do with you or I. Article 1, Article 2, Article 3, and the subsequent articles are really going to be a blueprint, a structure for how the federal government is to operate. Where you and I get a piece of that pie is through that inclusion of the Bill of Rights. And the anti-federalists are going to really push for the inclusion of those rights that are going to be explicitly mentioned. And you know them: right of free speech, right to bear arms, freedom of religion, right to protest and gather, at least not during, they can't gather during the COVID-19 crisis. Social distancing. The anti-federalists are going to come onto the scene and challenge this by saying that they want to, of course, a weak central government. They're going to look for state autonomy under a loose confederation of states. If a anti-federalist was looking into the future, they would say they like the European Union model, right? There's certain autonomy within each individual country, but they still come together with a loose confederation that is mutually beneficial, but not one that's going to usurp the authority of another. They're going to look to a largely agrarian class group of people in the Piedmont, Intermountain west of the Appalachians, that is, large plantation owners, your Jeffersonian agrarians. And lastly, they're going to reject this idea of anti. They don't like to be anything anti. So what ends up happening is a slow evolution of two parties. George Washington said in his farewell address, don't form political parties and don't form foreign alliances. Well, we jump into now the first bit of partisan America through the Federalists, but they're not going to politically call themselves the anti-federalists. So they're going to adopt this idea of that we're democratic, we believe in the ideals of the people, and we support a strong republic. So it makes sense that we're called Democratic Republicans. Now, you cannot attach the 2020 political landscape to what early America looks like. These aren't Democratic Republicans in the sense of FDR and Ronald Reagan, but these are Democratic Republicans that are later on going to become the Jacksonian Democrats that are going to really put power into the hands of the people. Federalists later on become Whigs. So the Virginia plan comes into play, in which James Madison is going to propose the big states naturally should have more representation in Congress. So Virginia, I'm making these numbers up, but would have 18 seats. New York would have 17 seats, and Rhode Island would have 2. Right? So these small states are going to rise up, particularly William Patterson in the New Jersey plan. And he's going to say, hold up just a second. That's completely unfair for these big states to have all this power, and then they're going to yield further power through voting and legislation. So I propose the New Jersey plan, in which every state gets an equal representative in that unicameral legislature. And he's going to propose just one person for every state. So this early unicameral legislature, at least under a William Patterson's New Jersey plan, is going to look like 13 people sitting together in a room. But it's going to be Roger Sherman coming in to save the day with his great compromise. It's going to say, hey, let's have the best of both worlds. Let's look at the British system of the House of Lords and the House of Commons, and let's have a Senate. I think one might be too small, so let's have 2 representatives from each state represent the upper house, and the lower house will be proportionally represented by the population of the people that live within that state. Of course, that's the system that's still in place to this very day. If I were a document in a DBQ and you had 4, for instance, reading passages, and you had this as your visual stimulus, I would encourage you to use the HAP. And particularly the H, the historical reasoning or the historical context of this. Looking at this map, we notice that a majority of the delegates that support the ratification of the Constitution are geographically specific to those that oppose ratification. And so why is that? Well, if you look and see that, well, a majority of these delegates, right, that support the Constitution are right along the coast. There's your major urban centers: Boston, New York, Philadelphia. These early major metropolitan areas, what we call now the Boswash Corridor, is going to be strongly supporting a constitution. So it might be fair to say that the agrarian class, the merchant class, the coastal classes do like a strong central government to help preserve some of that tax policy, some of those tariffs that are coming in and out of the country. We're out on the western front, right? Particularly in upstate New York and the Adirondacks and the Finger Lakes region up here to the north. We have the Piedmont, right? We have the Appalachian area here, finding that these individuals are going to be much more opposed to ratification. I like to liken them to individuals standing at a log cabin on the porch with a shotgun, telling the federal government to get off my lawn. Right? They're going to oppose that ratification. So the principles of the Constitution, this is basic kind of 8th grade U.S. history. You're going to have popular sovereignty. These are the staples of what it means to be a constitutional nation. So the people, we the people, are going to be responsible for our own destiny. Federalism, balancing the power between the state and the federal governments. And then we're going to take this power and separate it, and we're going to check and balance it. Again, with the executive branch appointing a Supreme Court justice, the Supreme Court ensuring that the laws passed by the legislature are constitutional, the legislature approving Supreme Court nominees, the legislature impeaching the president, right? All of these checks are in places. And then finally, the last two is limiting that governmental power and providing enumerated individual rights through that Bill of Rights. And these two debates are going to be kind of funneled out through the Federalist and Anti-Federalist, specifically through either a strict and explicit interpretation of the Constitution or a loose and implied. The Federalists themselves, right, who want an expansive federal government, are going to say that the Constitution is a guide. It's a rough outline. It can be moved. It's elastic. It allows us to move with society and lean in this way and interpret the Constitution this way and move back this way. And that kind of freedom, right, that movement for within the Federalist Party is going to be a very comforting opportunity for them to support that paradigm of constitutionality, where the Democratic Republicans, the anti-federalists, are going to say, nope, let's box us in. It's very strict. It's rigid. You can't move this way or this way. If this is what the law says, this is what the law means. Don't read into it and don't try to expand it. So that's why that paradigm has been shaped by those limited government individuals. We can divide now this partisanship, this debate of the Constitution between Federalists and Anti-Federalists now into a political structure. And I'll just, instead of reading you these slides, put these large slides up just for you to take kind of a 30,000 foot view of, to really understand who these Federalists are. Conservative, again, not meaning a social conservative in the 2020 constructs, but a conservative meaning they like things to remain the same, stability. That's why they like the British Empire. They like this kind of monarchy. John Adams even flirted with monarchy a number of times, calling George Washington his excellency. George Washington tampering that down and saying, dude, we just left a King George, and now you want to call me King George? That's not going to go well. They like a collective spirit, a centralized source of power that collectively support each other with that strong central government, having funds to put in a central bank, of course, having some sort of a national debt as opposed to individual state debts, which Alexander Hamilton is going to say allows us to build credit with those foreign nations. And they're going to be Anglophiles, supporting the British crown, not directly supporting the crown. There are some that just kind of like the English way, are still very traditionally Englishmen. On the flip side of that, we could play opposite day with the Democratic Republicans. If you're not classically conservative, well, you are classically liberal. If you if you don't like stability, you like change. If you don't like a loose constitutionality, you are a strict constitutionalist. If you don't like collectivism, you like individualism, strong local banks, and we have local debt that's going to be accrued locally and paid off locally, and they're going to be Francophiles. Look at all this liberal change that screams French Revolution. So Thomas Jefferson and the powerhouses of the Democratic Republicans are really going to support the efforts of France, calling upon what Lafayette did for our country and asking the nation to support France amidst the throes of their revolution at the beginning of the 19th century. But Hamilton's really going to push federalism to its max. He's going to really push that throttle forward and see how far he could push the United States towards a federal policy. He is, in essence, and I call it fattening the country's wallet. He's going to fund at par. he's going to assume state debt, he's going to apply taxes, and he is going to call for a national bank in which the national bank can collect funds, lend money out, and have an interest that will allow money to be generated through that national bank. But probably the most difficult for students to comprehend is this funding at par. And the easiest way I explain it to students is most of the wars in the country's history have been funded through the supporting of war bonds. And if we give a war bond that can be purchased by society, it actually acts as a twofold success. It brings money into the government so they could fight the war. And number two, it takes money out of circulation, which reduces inflation in a wartime economy. But the problem is after the Revolutionary War, we didn't have any money. So we couldn't, in essence, pay back the bonds when people came to cash those in. So if you bought a bond for $1, you're expecting to get a little bit of return on your bond, and the government, after the war is over or at any time, would pay you back $1.10. Just making some numbers up here to kind of just give you this example. But if they don't have any money from a national treasury to pay you back, well, then you're really at a big problem here. So speculators are going to buy back those bonds at a much cheaper rate. So John Johnson out here, who now has a bond that is worth $1, well, he's not going to get $1 or $1.10 back from the federal government. The speculator will buy it for 50 cents. And John Johnson is desperate for that money, so he will take that 50 cents over nothing. And now the speculator has a number of bonds that have been bought back at a much lower rate. Well, Alexander Hamilton, a guy who purchased many bonds himself, is going to fund all of those bonds and pay those back at par, meaning at face value. So guess who made a lot of money in the deal? Those speculators. And so those speculators are going to profit from this, increasing the wealth of the ruling class. But what Hamilton is going to justify is by paying back those bonds, it's going to show foreign investors and other states, for instance, that the government is good on paying back their debts, that you can trust the federal government. So this is going to be an important aspect of Alexander Hamilton's plan to fatten the wallet by making good on previously extended bonds. And finally, he's going to assume state debt. Take the debt of Georgia, take the debt of Virginia, take the debt of Massachusetts, assume those debts, and by assuming the debts, it's going to put it into a central pool, and those states are going to be in essence, in perpetual financial bondage to the federal government because those debts have been paid off. So the Hamilton financial plan is going to prove to have its growing pains, but one of the greatest successes that come out of this is the establishment of a first national bank. And then we're going to see the establishment or the rechartering of the second national bank under the Jacksonian era. But that failure of the recharter, the vetoing of the bank charter, is going to be problematic for Jackson. And we'll get there in period 4. So here it is, stepping back at 30,000 feet, looking at the divisiveness of America, divisive America through domestic affairs. Constitutional interpretation is going to be challenged. The size and scope of the federal government based on the balance of powers of federalism. There's Hamilton's financial plan in place, as well as rapid westward expansion. People are keep moving west. We are having the Battle of Fallen Timbers with Native Americans in the Northwest Territory. We're seeing forts still occupied by the British out there. The French are still trying to negotiate with the Native Americans with their fur trade. And we have a whole Spanish Empire west of the Mississippi River. So westward expansion is really going to challenge the domestic agenda of the United States. And let's couple that with one of the key battles between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, and that is over the French and the British issue, supporting the French Revolution for all that they did for us, or supporting the British, but then they're going to impress us on the high seas, and that's going to create all kinds of problems with us domestically. So the growing pains of the new nation are immense. Those domestic rebellions from the Newburgh Conspiracy, the uprising of the Paxton Boys and Shea and Whiskey Rebellion, which I encourage you to look at in your investigation guide, are going to really challenge the new nation. Foreign scandals like the XYZ affair and the Guinea affair, XYZ and those emissaries go to speak to the foreign minister, but expect a bribe to get an audience with the foreign minister, greatly insulting the reputation of the United States. Guinea coming to the United States and recruiting U.S. soldiers and other U.S. citizens to fight for the British cause, undermining George Washington and John Adams's kind of stance on proclamation of neutrality. Genet is going to be threatened to be sent back, but he's held in the United States so he doesn't get executed in France. But again, that's going to be fodder for the Federalists to say, you can't trust those French. The very, very powerful Federalist Party right now that seems to be reigning supreme under George Washington and John Adams are going to kind of now feeling their oats, going to implement the Alien and Sedition Acts, which are going to, in essence, violate the First Amendment right of free speech. It's going to limit the movement, the internal migration and immigration of new immigrants coming into the country. And it's those Alien and Sedition Acts that are really going to get, for instance, Kentucky and Virginia to push for this idea of nullification, this compact theory of the Constitution, which we'll talk about later on under the John Marshall Court. But Virginia and Kentucky, written by Thomas Jefferson, are going to say that we can nullify laws that we don't see as justifiable. And this is going to be a real state challenge to the Constitution that we're going to see rear its ugly head under John C. Calhoun in the South Carolina nullification crisis, and of course at the dawn of the Civil War in 1860. And lastly, that westward expansion, all eyes are on the Mississippi River. You know, the United States needs that Mississippi River. It's still Spanish controlled, as is the port of New Orleans. And so instead of getting into an all-out war, which the United States doesn't have the money to do so, are going to secure a treaty with Spain so that they can have use of the Mississippi and the mouth of the Mississippi to expand their federal presence, their economic presence, if you will. So they're numerous, ladies and gentlemen. Period 3 in a nutshell: French and Indian War, a massive amount of debt with the British Empire, revenue acts, pushback against those revenue acts, American Revolution, constitutionality, first starting under the Articles of Confederation of the U.S. Constitution, and then growing pains on a domestic front, and then in an international front after we now have a newfound document. That's a lot, isn't it? I thank you for sticking with me through this. If you have any questions, do put them in the comments below or put them on the forum. I'll be glad to answer those. But period 3, it's also a beast like period 7. But if we could just keep those 4 key components, French and Indian War, American Revolution, constitutionality, and growing pains of a new nation, I think we'll be in pretty good shape. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with me this evening for this moment of learning. And I look forward to welcoming you back right here next time for period 4, part 1, in which we feel good about ourselves in an era of good feelings after the War of 1812, which I'm going to call the American Revolution 2.0. Be well and be wise, and I'll see you right back here next time.